Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. All right, guys, so we are going to go ahead and take a little notes on macroevolution by speciation. This is where we left off last time. We've been talking about natural selection and about the adaptation of organisms to their environment. Well, today we're going to go ahead and hit up speciation, which is macroevolution. So in order to help you guys understand where we're going here, we're going to start off by clarifying the difference between macroevolution and microevolution. So far, the definition that we've been given for evolution is a change in allele frequencies within a population over time. Right, and that's the general definition of evolution. Okay, so what do we mean by micro and macro evolution? Okay, so I'm going to start off with microevolution because that's actually what we've been talking about this whole time. So microevolution refers to adaptation of traits due to natural selection. Natural or artificial selection, because we've seen that natural selection can also be used by humans to change animals, like the domestication of the fox. So microevolution is just adaptation of traits, but it doesn't actually change the species. What do I mean? So when we talked about the moths becoming darker due to the tree trunks changing color, that wasn't the moths becoming a different species. That was the moths still being moths, but they were just changing their color. That was an example of microevolution. The reason why is that they better adapted to their environment using artificial selection. So they changed their color to be well hidden against the trees, but they were the same species. The same is true of the foxes we looked at, so the foxes were domesticated. Even though the domesticated foxes had genetic differences and been chosen by artificial selection by people to be more friendly, they were still foxes at the end. And most people don't have a problem with microevolution. To be honest, most people are totally fine with it. Where people usually get a little bit hairy with evolution is macroevolution. So what do I mean by macroevolution? So macroevolution is when new species arise, that means to come out of, arise from old species. Okay, and they do this through a process called speciation. Okay, so this is essentially the same thing, the same definition as speciation. Okay, so what would that look like? Well, one of the most obvious examples that we all hear about all the time is, say, well, humans came from monkeys. And while that is not true, evolutionarily speaking, it sort of follows a similar idea of macroevolution, which is that new organisms that are distinct and different from other organisms had to come from somewhere. And in Darwin's unifying theory of natural selection and evolution, the idea is that all the diverse species we see today, from pigs to dogs to plants to underwater squidgy things that scoot around on the bottom of the ocean, all of those came from a common ancestor. We all came from one species that diverged and diverged and diverged until it became the species that we see today. And that happened through the process of macroevolution and speciation. Okay, so how does speciation work? Let's go ahead and take a look at the mechanics of speciation. The first thing we need to understand is that speciation can only occur when there are barriers to gene flow. Okay, what do I mean by barriers to gene flow? Okay, first of all, a barrier we know is something that keeps something out. In gene flow, what does that mean? Okay, so if we think about it, a gene is a part of our DNA that codes for a protein, right? We have multiple versions of genes called alleles, and so we can have a version of a gene that codes for eye color that gives us brown eyes, and that's the brown eye allele. And then we have the blue eye allele, which gives us blue eyes, right? So we know what a gene is. That's the code that creates the protein or the allele that makes our traits. But what do we mean by flow? Well, flow means to go from one place to the next. Okay, so I want us to imagine a scenario. I want us to imagine we have a population of dots. They're living dots in this case. And we're going to start off with 3 dots of each color in this population. Okay, so we can see that we have a population of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 individuals, which makes sense because we have 3 of each color and there are 4 colors. So we have 12 individuals, and if we started off looking at these, we'd say, okay, so 3 out of the 12 are going to be red, and we know that 3 out of the 12 are going to be purple, the same for blue, and the same for green. So each of these colors, we're going to pretend represents an allele in that population. Okay, so there's a color gene, and the red ones have the red allele or version of the color gene. The purple ones have purple, and the blue have the blue and the green, so on. Okay, so when we look at these allele frequencies here, we can see that the allele frequencies in the original population, it is not. We can see that the allele frequencies in the original population are all equal. Okay, so that means that here when we look at these, there is no one allele that's winning out within the population. But let's say that we have a selection event occur. Okay, so I'm going to go over here, I'm going to put selection. And we know that selection is the pressure that a... My car is in the front. It's in the front. Thank you. So we know that there is a selection event happening, and the selection event is when the environment selects, right, or chooses a certain trait. So we're going to go ahead and say the selection event occurs within this population, and that selection event is that blue is the most fit. Okay, so we're going to say that the blue dots are best able to survive and reproduce in the population because there is a predator, that eats all other colors besides blue. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and assume that blue is the most fit. So when we look back at the population after the selection event occurs, we're going to see something interesting. We're going to see something like this. 10, 11, 12. Okay, so we might see something like this. Okay, I kept it the same number of organisms as before, so there should still be 12 dots. But when we look at these 12 dots, we see that the allele frequencies have changed. We see that now there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 blue. So 7 out of the 12. We see that there are 2 green, 2 out of the 12. We see that there's only 1 red left, so 1 out of the 12. And there are 2 purple left, so 2 out of the 12. So let's make sure that equals up to 12. Yes. So now we see that the blue's frequency, in this case, the blue allele has become more common. Okay, so the alleles that are more selectively advantageous, the ones that allow for the dots to survive the best, are going to be the ones that increase the most in the population. And so we're going to see the population shift due to selection over to the blue. Okay, so that shows the change in allele frequencies. We've changed the allele frequencies, and that shows evolution. But what do we mean by gene flow? Okay, we're going to take this exact same scenario, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and steal our original population. So I'm going to go ahead and take these guys right here. So we're going to steal them, and we're going to move them into a brand new situation. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and copy these, and I'm going to move them over here. Okay, so here is our original population. I'm going to make them a little bit smaller because they're kind of big, and we're going to move them up here. Okay, so let's say we start with this original population, and everything is hunky-dory. And then what happens is that this population ends up splitting up. So let's say that there is a mountain range down here. Okay, so these are mountains. And let's say that 1/2 of the population, so 1/2 of the population moves over here. And let's say that 1/2 of the population moves over here. So in other words, the population has split up. This might have been because certain individuals wanted to go one way, the others didn't, whatever. But we now have half the population moving one way and half the population moving the other way. Okay, so now we have 6 individuals on each side. And let's go ahead and say, just for the sake of argument, that over here we had, let's say, the red and the purple move, although this could work out in any way. Okay, and let's say that over here we had the green and the blue move over here. Okay, now we see some obvious differences already in the phenotypes of these populations after they've moved, right? So the allele frequencies are different between the two. But there's something else we should notice. Once they move on either side of these mountains, they're not really going to be able to interbreed with each other, right? Unless they were to somehow go around or through the mountains. But we're going to pretend like the mountains are impassable, and whatever allowed them to move to different sides is now no longer possible. Okay, so in that case, what happens is that they cannot interbreed, and when they cannot interbreed, they cannot establish gene flow. Okay, we're going to go ahead and draw so over here, right? This would normally mean that they could interbreed, right? But we know that they cannot interbreed because of the mountains. And so in this case, we have restricted their gene flow. So gene flow basically means, if we take a look at this, that means that gene flow means interbreeding. Okay, which makes sense, right? Because if the individuals on the blue side over here were to move over and breed with the individuals on the red and purple side, then the blue allele would be reintroduced into the red and purple population, right? But since the mountains are there, they can't do that. So now that we've restricted gene flow, let's go ahead and imagine that different selective pressures occur on either side. Okay, so let's go ahead and say that over here on the left-hand side, we have selection occur, okay, and the selection is going to be against red, okay, and over here, the selection event is going to be against blue. Okay, so that means that over time, what's going to happen to these guys is going to be that in the next generation, if we have a selection against red, we might have only purple individuals. Okay, and then down here, if we have the selection event against blue, we might have only green individuals. Okay, so then what does this actually mean? All right, so let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to add our population back in. And this time we're going to take a look at the 2 different populations that have come out of it. Oops, okay. So we have our original population here, and now we have 2 new populations. Okay, so we have a purple population that has evolved out of this, all right, where 100% of the population is purple. So 100% purple. And over here, we have a green population that's evolved. And the green population, right, is 100% green. What's the significance of this? Well, the phenotypic change, the outward change, might not seem like a whole lot at all. Okay, but then what if these 2 were to suddenly re-interact with each other? Okay, so what if the mountains were to go ahead and disappear? All right, so we'll go ahead and say that the mountains disappear magically, just, you know, because it never happens in real life, but they just sink right into the ground. Who knew? So mountains disappear, whoa, and they reestablish contact with each other, right? And so they come back and they kind of meet each other again. So we have the purples being like, okay, hello again after many thousands of years being separated by these mountains, good Lord. And they look at each other and they're like, what is that? right? Because they started off being the same thing, the same dot species, but now they've changed so much over time that they look at each other and they don't recognize each other. Okay? They don't recognize each other. So now what happens is that they don't interbreed because they don't even recognize that they're the same thing. They're looking at each other now and they're like, oh my gosh, they're completely different. What is that? And so now they're not going to interbreed and they're two different species. Okay? So we now have we now have two new species. Now, when we talk about color in this case, I mean, color is not usually what happens here. Usually it's something a little bit more intense than color because we all know that humans come in all different colors and we still recognize the fact that we can interbreed with each other and that we're all people. So color isn't usually what happens in a phenotype. It's just easy to draw. But what are some big changes that could occur to make it so that organisms don't actually recognize each other as being the same species? I mean, that seems pretty intense. That seems like way more intense than just color. Okay, so I'll give you a new example here. Okay, so let's say that we look at a species of bird. Okay, so we originally start with this species of bird, and I'm going to draw my my bird species here. It's going to be brilliant. Look at that bird species right there. Isn't that awesome? And this bird species right here is going to have a very particular type of song. It's going to look like this, okay? And so that bird, you know, is kind of rocking out and jamming. And that song right there, this is this bird's mating call, okay? So it's recognized call of a band like, hey, you know, yeah, you know what I'm trying to say. So the mating call is what the birds use to mate, and without the mating call, they can't mate with each other, right? So this bird needs a mate. So I guess I'll draw a mate here for this bird. Okay, so the bird has a mate. So that's the normal mating call, and that's what the birds recognize. But now let's go ahead and say that this half of the population is going to move over here to the big city. So they're going to move in with all these big buildings and everything, and you know, they're gonna be city birds. They're gonna have like a main street and all that sort of stuff, and cars going down and traffic lights and all that fun stuff, right? They move to the big city, the Big Apple. Put some windows in these buildings. Okay, and then let's say that these birds over here, though, they're feeling more of the call of nature, and these birds over here, they move over to, you know, the forest where it's green and, you know, there's meadows and grasses and wildflowers and grass that's purple and red and all that sort of stuff. It's all fun. Okay, and so these two different, I think, but they're originally the same species, and then they suddenly moved to these different environments. Well, the sound over here is super loud. It is a loud city, right, with all of the noise and chaos going on over here. And so these birds, when they try to sing over here in this city, they can't be heard over the sound of the noise of the city. And so in order to compensate, the birds have to come up with a new song. And so their new song looks something like this. Okay. And so that's their new song, and that's what they have to do in order to be heard. So we're going to have to say we have a new mating call. A new mating call. Okay, and then over here on this side, okay, these birds, they moved over here, and actually, these birds are they're just fine using their old mating call. They don't have to change it at all, and so their mating call remains the same. Okay, now years later, they all moved back to the same place, right? Because they met in the middle. Now they're going to come back, and now when these birds try to do their mating song for the other birds, you know, they come up and they're like, "Hey, hey, good looking, like you look pretty awesome. I'm going to sing you my mating song," and they're like, "La," right? And when they sing their mating song, "La la," this bird over here is like, "No." And it's totally different. And so the birds from the city are like, what's happening? And the birds from the forest are like, I don't understand this person. And because they don't recognize each other, because they don't recognize, they don't breed. Okay, and now we have two species where we originally just had one. We have the species in the city and the species in the country. So there are three types of selective barriers to gene flow. Actually, there's four types we're going to very briefly talk about. And I know this is going on for a little bit. Speciation is kind of a long topic. So I'm going to make this as short, sweet, and to the point as I possibly can. Okay, so what are the four barriers to gene flow? So I'm going to say these are the four barriers to gene flow. Okay, so the four barriers to gene flow are, the first one is behavioral. Whoops, and that's what we just talked about. So behavioral is going to be when two individuals, so birds or whatever, two individuals don't interbreed, ooh, my handwriting, don't interbreed, because of different mating rituals. Okay, this could also have to do, however, with appearance. So they might not look the way that the other individual looks or acts or does their mating dance or whatever. So that's behavioral. It's a preference for a mate. Okay, and so attractive preferences are often considered behavioral. The second type, which actually goes back to one of the previous examples, is geographic. Okay, and so like the example with the mountains, there's a mountain range in the way now, and so suddenly we have geographic isolation. And so when a physical land feature, like a mountain or a river or something, separates gene flow between two populations. Okay, so just like that original example that we came up with. The third way is mechanical. And how do I say mechanical I'm just going to say it this way. The parts don't fit, okay? So, like, if a cow and a grasshopper really like each other, it doesn't really matter how hard they try. They're never going to be able to make kids because their parts just don't go together, okay? So the parts don't fit in mechanical, and that's about as much detail as I want to get into that. I think you know what I mean. Okay, and then finally, and really, actually, I'm going to go ahead. Sorry, I'm going to add one more thing over here, which is genetic. Okay, and that means that the sperm and egg can't combine. I'm going to kind of put that with the physical because oftentimes when two organisms physically can't mate, then their sperm and their egg can't combine. Okay, so we have behavioral, geographic, and mechanical. What is the last one? The last one is temporal. So, whoops, and I want this to be in a different color. So temporal isolation means that the timing, like mating seasons or whatever, doesn't work. Okay, so in other words, mating seasons don't align. And you can all kind of think of, I think, an example of this. You know, when you're in a relationship and you really want to be in a relationship with this other person, but you're in a relationship and so you can't be, and then you get out of that relationship, and then the other person you wanted to have a relationship is in one, and it's like you guys just keep passing each other and you never like can quite get together. That's like temporal isolation, right? So you can never quite get together. So those are the four different barriers to gene flow, and there's going to be some practice in your Google Classroom for these. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the final part of this. So we've established that speciation is new species arising from old. We've established that this happens because of barriers to gene flow, and we've established that there are four major barriers to gene flow, five if you count genetic, which stop organisms from mating with each other and therefore causing them to differentiate and to speciate. Okay, and so now we're going to go ahead and kind of put all of this together into the two big types of speciation or macroevolution. So there are two big types of speciation, and they're based off of the type of barriers that these organisms encounter. So the first one is called allopatric, and allopatric speciation is a funny word. I'm going to tell you a way that I remember it in a second, but allopatric speciation just means that new species arise. Remember, that means to come out of due to geographic barriers. Okay, so like a mountain gets in the way, splits a population, that's allopatric. How I like to remember allopatric is I like to think about two people who are separated for a long time, and one of them moves to England and the other one stays wherever they are. And the one that moved to England's name was Patrick. And so later when they come back together again, the person who didn't move and hasn't seen Patrick in a while is like, "Hello, Patrick," making fun of his new British accent. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how I remember it. Second type, and the last type, is sympatric. And sympatric means that the speciation occurs in the same place, so there's no geographic barriers due to behavioral, temporal, or genetic barriers. Oops, genetic or mechanical, or mechanical barriers. Okay, so basically it happens in the exact same place, and it happens because of those things rather than the individuals being physically separated within the population. Okay, so hopefully this has helped you guys to understand speciation. I know it's a little bit long-winded. Speciation is kind of a long thing, and you got to put it together. I'm going to put a couple of other helpful videos for this into the Google Classroom, and you guys will have a quick little practice with barriers to speciation and gene flow. And I'm going to put a fun little assignment and activity on there for you guys to do. But I hope you've enjoyed this, and welcome to Digital Learning. The videos in the future, some of them will be shorter, and I'm going to sort of stick to that, but I always want them to be at the very least under 30 minutes. Most of them should be between 20 and 25. Anyway, stay well, stay healthy, and enjoy your homeschooling.